What happens when a quiet family dinner becomes a flashpoint for racial injustice? When officers sworn to protect and serve instead profile and intimidate? And when the very man they're targeting has risked his life countless times defending the freedoms they're now trampling? It's a warm Saturday evening in Riverside, Tennessee, and the Hamilton family is enjoying what should be a peaceful meal at Miller's Diner, a local institution known for its home-style cooking and small-town atmosphere. Commander Marcus Hamilton, a decorated Navy SEAL with 15 years of service, sits across from his wife, Dr. Angela Hamilton, a pediatrician, and their two children, 16-year-old Destiny and 12-year-old Marcus J.R. The family is celebrating Marcus Jr.'s acceptance into the gifted and talented program at his school. The conversation flows easily. Talk of upcoming deployments, Destiny's college applications, and Angela's research at the local children's hospital. They're the picture of American success, a family that has sacrificed and served their country with honor. But in the eyes of officers Jake Morrison and Brad Stevens, who have just entered the diner, the Hamilton family represents something else entirely. They see a black family in a predominantly white establishment, and their trained suspicion immediately kicks in. They don't see a Navy SEAL who has conducted classified operations in some of the world's most dangerous places. They don't see a doctor who has saved countless children's lives. They see a threat that needs to be neutralized. What unfolds in the next hour will expose the harsh reality that military service, no matter how distinguished, cannot shield black Americans from the persistent cancer of racism. It will reveal how even those who have proven their patriotism and courage in defense of democracy can become victims of the very prejudice they've fought to overcome. This is the story of how one family's quiet dinner became a battle for dignity, justice, and the right to exist peacefully in the country they've served so faithfully. Marcus Hamilton's journey to the Navy SEALs began in the housing projects of Detroit, Michigan, where he was born in 1978 to a single mother who worked double shifts as a hospital custodian to keep her family afloat. Growing up in a city ravaged by economic decline and racial tensions, Marcus learned early that excellence was the only path to escape the limitations that society placed on young black men. His mother, Dorothy Hamilton, had raised Marcus and his younger sister with an unwavering belief in education and service. "You have to be twice as good to get half as much," she would tell them, a refrain that echoed through generations of black families who understood the additional burden their children would carry. The historical context of Marcus's upbringing was crucial to understanding his later experiences. Detroit in the 1980s and 1990s was a city still reeling from the racial tensions of the 1960s, economic devastation, and the crack epidemic. For young black men like Marcus, the military often represented one of the few paths to economic stability and respectability. When Marcus joined the Navy in 1996, he was part of a long tradition of African American military service that stretched back to the Revolutionary War. But this service came with its own unique challenges. Research shows that black military personnel have historically faced discrimination, both within the ranks and in the civilian communities where they're stationed. The Navy SEALs, America's most elite special operations force, presented even greater challenges for black service members. Out of approximately 2,500 active SEALs, only about 50 are black, a mere 2% representation that reflects both systemic barriers and cultural factors. Marcus was one of the few who managed to break through these barriers, but the journey was far from easy. The Hamilton family's ordeal demonstrates that racism operates at multiple levels in American society. It's not just about individual bias, but about systemic patterns of discrimination that affect black families regardless of their contributions to society. A decorated Navy SEAL and his physician wife, along with their honor roll children, faced harassment simply because of their race. But their story also shows the power of resistance and the importance of community support. When Marcus stood up to the officers and asserted his family's rights, he didn't just protect his own family. He struck a blow for justice that resonated far beyond that restaurant. His courage, combined with the support of his military colleagues and community members, created a moment of accountability that might not have existed otherwise. The incident at Miller's Diner reminds us that the fight for racial justice is not just about changing laws or policies. It's about changing hearts and minds. It's about creating a society where all families, regardless of race, can enjoy a simple dinner without fear of harassment or intimidation. As we move forward, the Hamilton family's experience calls us to action. We must demand accountability from law enforcement, support military families facing discrimination, and work to create communities where service and sacrifice are honored regardless of race. Their courage in standing up to injustice shows us that change is possible, but it requires all of us to speak up when we witness racism and discrimination. The question now is, will we have the courage to follow their example? During his initial training at Basic Underwater Demolition SEAL Bud S training in Coronado, California, Marcus faced not only the legendary physical challenges of the program, but also the subtle and not so subtle manifestations of racial bias. Instructors questioned his swimming abilities based on racial stereotypes. Classmates made jokes about his background, and he constantly felt the pressure of representing his entire race. But Marcus persevered, driven by his mother's words and his own determination to prove that excellence knows no color. He graduated from Bud S in the top 10% of his class and was assigned to SEAL Team 3, based in Coronado. Over the next 15 years, he would deploy to Iraq, Afghanistan, and various classified locations, earning numerous commendations including the Bronze Star, the Navy and Marine Corps Commendation Medal, and the Combat Action Ribbon. His wife, Dr. Angela Hamilton, understood the unique challenges of being a black military spouse. Born in Atlanta to a middle-class family, she had experienced her own share of discrimination while pursuing her medical degree at Emory University. She knew that their family would face scrutiny and challenges that white military families never encountered. The couple had met in 2005, when Marcus was recovering from injuries sustained during a mission in Iraq. Angela was completing her residency at Walter Reed Army Medical Center, and their romance blossomed over shared experiences of overcoming adversity and a commitment to serving others. They married in 2007, and Angela embraced the challenges of military life, including frequent moves and long deployments. The Hamilton family's experience reflected broader patterns documented in recent research on military families of color. Studies show that 42% of active duty service members of color have turned down assignments due to concerns about racism in certain locations. Military families of color report experiencing harassment from neighbors, racial profiling by local law enforcement, and general hostility in predominantly white communities. When Marcus was assigned to Naval Support Activity Mid-South in Millington, Tennessee, the family hoped for a fresh start. Tennessee offered a lower cost of living, good schools for their children, and proximity to extended family. But the state's history of racial tension, combined with its conservative political climate, created an environment where the family frequently felt like outsiders. The children, Destiny and Marcus Jr., attended predominantly white schools where they were often the only black students in their classes. They excelled academically. Destiny was valedictorian material, and Marcus Jr. was in the gifted program, but they also faced the constant burden of representing their race in every interaction. Marcus had reached the rank of commander and was considered for promotion to the Naval Special Warfare Development Group, commonly known as SEAL Team 6. His record was impeccable. His leadership skills were recognized throughout the special operations community, and his men trusted him completely. But he also understood that his race would always be a factor in how others perceived him, both within the military and in civilian society. The family's dinner at Miller's Diner on that Saturday evening in March 2023 was meant to be a celebration of Marcus Jr.'s academic achievement and a rare moment of normalcy in their high-stress military life. They had no idea that their peaceful evening would become a catalyst for confronting the persistent racism that shadows even the most distinguished black military families. The trouble began the moment officers Jake Morrison and Brad Stevens entered Miller's Diner at 7:30 p.m. Morrison, a 15-year veteran of the Riverside Police Department, had a reputation for aggressive policing, particularly in the black community. Stevens, younger and eager to prove himself, often followed Morrison's lead without question. As they scanned the dining room, their eyes immediately locked onto the Hamilton family. In a restaurant filled with mostly white patrons, the presence of a black family seemed to trigger an automatic response. Morrison whispered something to Stevens, and both officers began observing the family with suspicious intensity. The Hamilton family was completely unaware of the scrutiny. Marcus was helping Marcus Jr. with his math homework while Angela and Destiny discussed college applications. The conversation was animated and joyful, the kind of family bonding that should have been heartwarming to observe. But to Morrison and Stevens, the family's presence felt somehow inappropriate. "Keep an eye on that table," Morrison murmured to Stevens. "Something doesn't feel right." The officers approached the hostess, Sarah Miller, whose family had owned the diner for 3 generations. Morrison asked if she knew the black family in booth 7, his tone suggesting something suspicious about their presence. "They're regulars," Sarah replied, confused by the question. "The Hamilton family. They're good people, always polite, tip well." Why? Morrison didn't answer directly. Instead, he asked for the check for table 7, claiming he wanted to verify how they were paying. This request was both unusual and inappropriate. There was no legitimate law enforcement reason to investigate a family's payment method. As the officers lingered near the Hamilton family's table, their presence became increasingly obvious. Other diners began to notice the police attention, and whispers started to spread throughout the restaurant. The comfortable atmosphere of the diner was quickly becoming tense and uncomfortable. Marcus was the first to notice the officer's interest. His military training had taught him to be aware of his surroundings, and he immediately recognized the signs of being surveilled. He discreetly squeezed Angela's hand under the table, a signal they had developed over years of marriage to communicate potential danger. "What's wrong?" Angela asked quietly, noticing her husband's sudden alertness. "We're being watched," Marcus replied, his voice calm but concerned. "Act normal, but be ready." The children, sensing the change in their parents' demeanor, began to look around nervously. Destiny, who had experienced racial profiling before, immediately understood what was happening. Marcus Jr., younger and more innocent, simply felt confused by the sudden tension. Officer Morrison finally approached the table, his hand resting on his service weapon in a gesture that was both threatening and completely inappropriate for the situation. The Hamilton family was sitting quietly, eating their meal, and posed no conceivable threat to anyone. "Good evening," Morrison said, his tone official and cold. "I'm Officer Morrison with the Riverside Police Department. We've received reports of suspicious activity in this area." Marcus looked up calmly, his military bearing evident even in civilian clothes. "Good evening, officer. How can we help you?" Morrison's eyes narrowed. He hadn't expected such a composed response, and the man's confident manner seemed to irritate him. "We're going to need to see some identification from everyone at this table." "May I ask why?" Marcus asked, his voice still respectful, but with an edge of steel. "We're just having dinner with our family." "Don't question me," Morrison snapped. "IDs now." The restaurant had fallen silent. Every patron was now watching the confrontation unfold, their faces showing a mixture of curiosity, discomfort, and concern. Some pulled out their phones to record the interaction, sensing that something significant was happening. Angela, drawing on her medical training to remain calm under pressure, slowly reached for her purse. "Of course, officer. We're happy to cooperate." As she handed over her driver's license, Morrison noticed her profession listed as physician. This seemed to surprise him, as if he hadn't expected to find a doctor in a black family. He studied the license carefully, looking for any reason to find fault. Marcus handed over his military ID, which clearly identified him as a Navy commander. Morrison's reaction was immediate and telling, rather than showing the respect typically accorded to military officers. He seemed almost angry that Marcus held such a high rank. "Navy, huh?" Morrison said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "What? Are you some kind of cook?" The insult was deliberate and cruel. Morrison was referencing the historical stereotype that black servicemen were relegated to support roles like cooking and cleaning, ignoring the fact that Marcus's ID clearly identified him as a SEAL officer. Marcus's jaw tightened, but he maintained his composure. "Special operations," he replied simply. Stevens, who had been silent until now, stepped forward. "We're going to need you to step outside, sir. There are some questions we need to ask you." "Questions about what?" Marcus asked. "We haven't done anything wrong." "That's for us to determine," Morrison replied. "Stand up, turn around, and put your hands behind your back." The restaurant erupted in murmurs and gasps. Several patrons were now openly recording the encounter, and some were calling out that the police were going too far. Sarah Miller, the restaurant owner, approached the officers. "Officers, please," she said, her voice shaking with nervousness. "This family hasn't done anything wrong. They're regular customers, and they're just trying to have dinner." Morrison, "World honor. Ma'am, I'm going to need you to step back and let us do our job." Angela stood up, her medical training kicking in as she assessed the dangerous escalation of the situation. "Officers, there must be some misunderstanding. My husband is a decorated Navy SEAL. We're just having dinner with our children." "I don't care what he is," Morrison replied, his mask of professionalism finally slipping. "He's coming with us." As Morrison moved to arrest Marcus, several things happened simultaneously. Destiny began recording on her phone, her hands shaking with fear and anger. Marcus Jr. started to cry, overwhelmed by the situation. Angela positioned herself between the officers and her husband, her maternal instincts overriding her fear. And Marcus made a decision that would change everything. Instead of submitting to an illegal arrest, instead of allowing his family to be humiliated by racist cops, Marcus stood up to his full height and spoke with the authority of a man who had commanded elite soldiers in combat. "Officers," he said, his voice carrying the unmistakable tone of command, "I am a United States Navy SEAL, and I am ordering you to step back from my family. You have no probable cause for this harassment, and you are violating our civil rights." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. Morrison and Stevens, suddenly faced with a man who clearly knew his rights and had the presence to assert them, hesitated. The restaurant was now completely silent, except for the sound of multiple phones recording the encounter. What happened next would determine whether justice would prevail or whether another black family would become victims of police misconduct. Confrontation at Miller's Diner reached a critical juncture as Marcus, Hamilton's military authority, clashed with Officer Morrison's racial prejudice. The moment Marcus identified himself as a Navy SEAL and asserted his family's rights, the dynamic in the restaurant shifted palpably. Morrison, faced with unexpected resistance, doubled down on his aggressive approach. "I don't care what you claim to be," he snarled, reaching for his handcuffs. "You're interfering with a police investigation. But Marcus was no longer the frightened young man from Detroit's housing projects. He was a seasoned warrior who had faced down terrorists and enemy combatants. His voice carried the weight of 15 years of military command when he responded, "Officer, I am not interfering with anything. I am exercising my constitutional rights, and I am protecting my family from harassment. You have no probable cause, no warrant, and no justification for your actions." The standoff that followed was captured on multiple cell phones, and the footage would later become crucial evidence. Marcus stood perfectly still, his hands visible, his posture non-threatening but authoritative. He understood that any sudden movement could be used to justify violence against him. Angela, drawing on her medical training and her experience as a military spouse, began documenting the encounter. "Officers Morrison and Stevens," she said clearly, ensuring the recording devices would capture her words, "you have provided no legal justification for questioning my family. We are documenting this encounter for our legal protection." The mention of legal protection seemed to give Morrison pause. He looked around the restaurant, suddenly aware that dozens of witnesses were recording his actions. But his pride and prejudice wouldn't allow him to back down gracefully. "You're resisting arrest," Morrison declared, though he had never clearly articulated what Marcus was supposedly being arrested for. "I am not resisting anything," Marcus replied calmly. "I am asking you to state the charges against me and to provide legal justification for your actions." Sarah Miller, the restaurant owner, found her courage and approached the officers again. "Officers, please. These are good people. They've never caused any trouble. Can't you just let them finish their dinner?" Morrison's response revealed the depth of his racial animus. "Ma'am, you don't understand what kind of people you're dealing with. They don't belong in a place like this." The racist statement was captured on multiple recordings, and gasps erupted throughout the restaurant. Morrison had finally said what everyone suspected he was thinking, that the Hamilton family didn't belong in a white establishment. Destiny, who had been quietly recording the encounter, finally spoke up. "Dad, the whole internet is watching this. #DinnerWhileBlack is already trending." Indeed, the live-streamed encounter was spreading rapidly across social media platforms. Local news outlets were receiving tips about the incident, and civil rights organizations were being alerted to the situation. Marcus recognized that the encounter had reached a point where de-escalation was essential. He had proven his point about standing up to illegal police actions, but he also understood that continuing the confrontation could put his family in physical danger. "Officer Morrison," Marcus said, his voice still calm but carrying unmistakable authority, "I am going to give you an opportunity to end this encounter professionally. My family and I are going to pay our check and leave. If you attempt to prevent us from doing so without legal justification, you will be violating our civil rights, and the consequences will be severe." The word consequences carried weight. When spoken by a man who clearly understood the legal and political implications of police misconduct, Morrison, perhaps beginning to realize the gravity of his situation, hesitated. But Stevens, the younger officer, made the decision that would transform a tense encounter into a full-blown crisis. "Nobody's going anywhere," he declared, moving to physically block the family's exit from the booth. Marcus's military training kicked in. He assessed the threat level, identified exits, and prepared to protect his family if necessary. But he also understood that any physical confrontation with police officers would be used to justify violence against him, regardless of who initiated it. "Officer Stevens," Marcus said, his voice now carrying the hard edge of a man who had seen combat, "you are illegally detaining my family. We are leaving." As Marcus stood up, Stevens made the fatal mistake of placing his hand on his weapon. The gesture was threatening and completely inappropriate for the situation, but it was also the moment that everything changed. "Gun!" Someone shouted from across the restaurant, and chaos erupted. Diners began scrambling for exits. Children were crying, and the peaceful atmosphere of Miller's Diner was shattered. Marcus immediately moved to shield his family, his body positioning reflecting years of tactical training. Angela gathered the children, her medical training helping her remain calm in the crisis. Destiny continued recording, understanding that documentation was crucial for justice. But the most significant development was occurring outside the restaurant. The live-streamed encounter had attracted the attention of local news outlets, civil rights organizations, and even some of Marcus's military colleagues who recognized him from the video footage. Within minutes, the restaurant parking lot was filled with additional police vehicles, news vans, and concerned citizens who had seen the social media coverage. The incident had grown beyond a simple case of police harassment into a community-wide confrontation about racial justice and police accountability. Master Chief Ray Thompson, Marcus's former commanding officer, arrived at the scene after seeing the social media coverage. His presence immediately changed the dynamic, as his military rank and white skin gave him credibility with the police officers that Marcus had been denied. "What's the situation here?" Thompson asked Officer Morrison, his tone professional but concerned. Morrison, suddenly faced with a white military officer asking questions, became defensive. "We're investigating suspicious activity," he replied, though his explanation sounded hollow even to him. Thompson looked at Marcus, recognizing the signs of a man under stress, but maintaining his composure. "Commander Hamilton is one of our finest officers," he said to Morrison. "If there's been some misunderstanding, perhaps we can resolve it professionally." The arrival of additional military personnel, community leaders, and media attention had transformed the encounter from a private harassment into a public accountability moment. The Hamilton family's quiet dinner had become a flashpoint for broader conversations about racism, police misconduct, and the treatment of black military families. The turning point came when Lieutenant Colonel James Mitchell, a commanding officer of the local naval support activity, arrived at Miller's Diner. His presence commanded immediate attention from both the police officers and the growing crowd of onlookers. Mitchell, a white officer with 30 years of military service, had served alongside Marcus in Iraq and understood both his character and his capabilities. When he saw the social media footage of the encounter, he didn't hesitate to intervene. "Personally, what's the situation here?" Mitchell asked Officer Morrison, his tone carrying the authority of someone accustomed to command. Morrison, suddenly faced with a high-ranking military officer, attempted to justify his actions. "Sir, we received reports of suspicious activity, and this individual has been uncooperative with our investigation." Mitchell looked at Marcus, who remained standing protectively in front of his family, and then back at Morrison. "Officer, Commander, Hamilton is one of the most decorated Navy SEALs in the United States military. He has conducted classified operations in defense of this country. What exactly did he do that you consider suspicious?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Morrison, who had been operating on prejudice and assumption, suddenly found himself having to articulate specific reasons for his actions. Silence stretched uncomfortably as he struggled to provide a coherent response. He was acting suspiciously," Morrison finally said, his voice lacking conviction. "Acting suspiciously how?" Mitchell pressed. "Was he threatening anyone? Was he committing a crime? Was he disturbing the peace?" The crowd that had gathered outside the restaurant was now pressing against the windows, watching the confrontation unfold. Local news crews had arrived, and the story was being broadcast live on television and social media. Sarah Miller, the restaurant owner, found her voice again. "Officers, I told you when you first arrived that the Hamilton family are regular customers. They've never caused any trouble. They were just having dinner with their children." Mitchell turned to the crowd of witnesses. "Did anyone see this family? Do anything wrong? A chorus of voices responded, "No, they were just eating." The police started harassing them for no reason. The weight of public opinion was becoming clear. Morrison and Stevens were facing a room full of witnesses, multiple recordings, and growing media attention. What had started as a routine case of racial profiling was becoming a public relations nightmare for the Riverside Police Department. But the real turning point came when Marcus himself spoke, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had commanded respect in life and death situations. "Officer Morrison," Marcus said, his tone calm but firm, "I have served this country for 15 years. I have risked my life in combat to protect the freedoms that you are now violating. I have earned the right to eat dinner with my family without being harassed because of the color of my skin." The power of his words was undeniable. Here was a man who had literally put his life on the line for American values, being denied the basic dignity of eating in a restaurant. The contrast between his service and his treatment was stark and impossible to ignore. Angela stepped forward, her medical training evident in her composed demeanor. "Officers, as a physician, I can tell you that this encounter has been traumatic. For my children, they are honor students who have done nothing wrong, and they are being subjected to police harassment simply because of their race." Destiny, who had been recording the entire encounter, held up her phone. "The whole world is watching this," she said, her young voice carrying surprising strength. "People need to see how black families are treated, even when our father is a war hero." The convergence of technology, community support, and moral authority created an unstoppable force for accountability. Morrison and Stevens found themselves facing not just a black family they thought they could intimidate, but a community demanding justice. Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell made the decision that would end the standoff. "Officers, I am personally vouching for Commander Hamilton and his family. If you have no specific charges to file, this encounter needs to end now." The statement carried weight because it came from a white military officer, but it also highlighted the tragic reality that Marcus's own word and credentials weren't enough to protect him from racial harassment. Morrison, faced with overwhelming evidence that his actions were wrong and potentially illegal, finally backed down. "There's been a misunderstanding," he said, his voice barely audible. "You're free to go," but the damage was done. The encounter had been recorded, broadcast, and witnessed by dozens of people. The Hamilton family's traumatic experience had become a symbol of the persistent racism that black military families face. Despite their service and sacrifice. As the family finally left the restaurant, they were greeted by a crowd of supporters, including many of Marcus's military colleagues, who had seen the coverage and come to show their support. The incident had exposed uncomfortable truths about racism in America, but it had also demonstrated the power of community support and the importance of standing up for justice. The real victory wasn't just that the family was allowed to leave unharmed. It was that their dignity and courage had sparked a broader conversation about equality, justice, and the treatment of those who serve our country. The aftermath of the Miller's Diner incident reverberated far beyond the small town of Riverside, Tennessee. Within 24 hours, the video footage had been viewed millions of times across social media platforms, and the story had been picked up by national news outlets. The hashtag dinner, while black, became a rallying cry for those demanding police accountability and racial justice. The immediate consequences for Officers Morrison and Stevens were swift and severe. The Riverside Police Department, facing intense public pressure and potential federal investigation, placed both officers on administrative leave pending a full investigation. Police Chief Robert Davis, who had initially tried to defend his officers' actions, was forced to hold a press conference acknowledging that their conduct was inappropriate and not representative of our department's values. The investigation that followed revealed a troubling pattern of behavior by Officer Morrison. Internal Affairs discovered multiple complaints of racial profiling and excessive force, most of which had been previously dismissed or inadequately investigated. The evidence was overwhelming. Morrison had a history of targeting black citizens, and the Hamilton family incident was just the most visible example of his misconduct. For the Hamilton family, the immediate impact was both traumatic and transformative. Marcus Jr. required counseling to process the trauma of seeing his father threatened by police officers. Destiny, who had courageously documented the encounter, became an advocate for police reform and racial justice. Angela found herself speaking at medical conferences about the health impacts of racism on families. Marcus himself struggled with the aftermath. A man who had faced enemy fire without flinching found himself questioning whether his service had been worth it. How could he risk his life for a country that wouldn't protect his family from harassment? The psychological impact was profound, and he sought counseling through military support services. But the family's courage in standing up to injustice had created something powerful. The incident sparked a broader conversation about the treatment of black military families and the persistent racism that military service cannot shield them from. Commander Hamilton received letters of support from fellow service members, veterans organizations, and citizens who were inspired by his dignity under pressure. The legal consequences were significant. The Hamilton family filed a federal civil rights lawsuit against the Riverside Police Department, Officers Morrison and Stevens, and the city of Riverside. The case, supported by the NAACP Legal Defense Fund and other civil rights organizations, sought damages for the violation of their constitutional rights and demanded systemic reforms to prevent future incidents. The military response was unprecedented. The Department of Defense announced new policies to better support military families facing discrimination in civilian communities. The Navy created a special liaison office to address complaints of racial harassment affecting military personnel and their families. Commander Hamilton was chosen to lead these initiatives, turning his traumatic experience into a platform for positive change. The community of Riverside itself was forced to confront uncomfortable truths about racism and justice. The incident divided the town, with some residents supporting the Hamilton family and others defending the police officers. But the national attention brought economic pressure. Businesses faced boycotts, and tourism declined as the town became associated with racial injustice. Miller's Diner, where the incident occurred, became an unexpected symbol of reconciliation. Sarah Miller, the owner, used the attention to create a scholarship fund for minority students and implemented diversity training for her staff. The restaurant now displays a sign reading, "All Families Welcome," and the booth where the Hamilton family was harassed has been designated as a reminder of the ongoing struggle for racial justice. The broader impact extended to policy changes at state and federal levels. The incident contributed to renewed discussions about police reform, racial profiling, and the need for better training and accountability. Several states implemented new policies, requiring police departments to track and report racial profiling incidents. Officers Morrison and Stevens faced different fates. Morrison was terminated from the police department and faced federal charges for violating the Hamilton family's civil rights. Stevens, who was younger and seen as following Morrison's lead, was suspended without pay and required to undergo extensive retraining and psychological evaluation. The Hamilton family's experience became a case study in military academies and police training programs, highlighting the intersection of racial bias and respect for military service. Their story demonstrates that racism affects all Black Americans, regardless of their service, education, or social status. Most importantly, the incident at Miller's Diner showed that resistance to injustice is possible, even in the face of intimidation and harassment. The Hamilton family's courage in standing up to illegal police actions inspired others to speak out against racism and demand accountability from law enforcement. Today, Commander Hamilton continues to serve in the Navy while also working on racial justice initiatives. His experience has made him a reluctant but powerful advocate for change within the military and law enforcement communities. The story of Commander Marcus Hamilton and his family at Miller's Diner represents more than an isolated incident of police misconduct. It's a window into the persistent reality of racism in America and the courage required to confront it. Their experience exposes the uncomfortable truth that military service, professional achievement, and personal character cannot shield Black Americans from the effects of racial prejudice.